Unless you're new to the channel, or have been living under a rock, or are watching this video years after it came out, you may have noticed that I've been talking about the Don't Hug Me I'm Scared TV series a lot. And of course, with that in mind, it made me want to go back and analyze the most disturbing English web series on YouTube. Yeah, you all probably saw this coming. It's finally time to talk about Salad Fingers. Created by David Firth, Salad Fingers is one of the most infamous independent animated web series in internet history. Beginning as a Newgrounds animation in 2004, Salad Fingers quickly grasped the attention of many online for a pretty clear reason. Salad Fingers is surreal as hell. People would hype this up as one of the most disturbing animations online due to its art style, the sound design, and the strange behavior of the title character, Salad Fingers. Well, is that even his real name? Let alone a name he calls himself? He said he has salad fingers, but as for a name, the closest we've gotten is Mr. Fingers. So I'll just refer to him as Mr. Fingers throughout the video, partially because I also find that name to be funny. If you haven't yet seen Salad Fingers, it's yet another series that I highly recommend. The series is still ongoing, with 12 episodes and 2 bonus episodes made to celebrate David Firth reaching 1 million subscribers on YouTube and the opening of his online merch store. If you'd like, consider watching Salad Fingers before watching this video. If you'd prefer to watch this series afterwards, or aren't sold on it yet, keep watching and I'm sure you'll find something interesting about this series. We'll go through the character of Mr. Fingers first, then the setting, then what other big details are shown and can be theorized from standout moments from throughout the series. So without going too deep into episode-dependent analyses, we can grasp some details from surface knowledge. Mr. Fingers has a zombie-like design with these 3 long fingers on each hand. It's likely this is the result of some kind of mutation, as we see the few other human-like characters in this show also display some mutations to their body structures and physical features, but in vastly different ways. It's also worth noting that there are some other humans out there that aren't noticeably mutated, and some with very similar appearances to Mr. Fingers, so there are outliers for sure. Mr. Fingers, though, acts very differently from the other zombie-like mutants. He still acts rather civilized and behaves like he's talking to an audience. He always wears the same dirty clothes, moves in an unsettling fashion, and speaks in a whispery voice. This all makes Mr. Fingers seem very mysterious. Upon first viewing, you may have thought he seemed predatory, but the more you watch, the more you can piece together that he's actually a troubled person, the byproduct of past tragedies and trauma. That's why he always does and says seemingly nonsensical things. That's why he plays with inanimate objects like finger puppets and non-functional machines. That's why he's constantly jumping between emotions. But we'll go into all of that in a bit. Some other noteworthy details worth mentioning. One of the first things we learn from Mr. Fingers is that he likes the texture of metal, especially rusty metal. We see he kept around a rusty spoon. He can't help himself from touching a hook and stabbing his finger with it, and he has a big fascination for taps. When he bleeds, that's usually followed by him passing out or coming close to passing out. It's not a thing that happens whenever he sees blood, though. It's more likely these moments occurred due to a low pain tolerance rather than being squeamish. In fact, he's even stated before that he likes the red water. Mr. Fingers demonstrates an inability to read or write, but fluency in speaking English along with potential fluency in French and Morse code. He's fond of peeling his skin, tasting inedible things, and sometimes finds himself behaving in feminine ways. Again, part of him jumping between emotions and behaviors. Now that we've got some non-spoilery details on Mr. Fingers laid out, let's build some more context by talking about the setting. Firstly, we can assume that this is taking place in some form of the United Kingdom, as evidenced by all characters speaking English with English accents. Plus, Mr. Fingers mentions Croxley and Cowden Beath, both being a real-world village and town respectively in the UK. That and the fact that David Firth is English. But now there's the question of when this is set and why the setting appears as it does. I believe MatPat was pretty spot on when it came to his theory on the setting. Actually, just go ahead and check out his theories on Salad Fingers if you haven't already. He did a great job with all of those, and again, his discoveries and theories in those videos do seem very accurate. Right off the bat, Mr. Fingers mentions the Great War numerous times. The Great War being what World War I was known as before anyone knew there would be another. So we have a time frame of 1914 to 1939, the time between the start of World War I and the start of World War II. Then from other references made by Mr. Fingers, including singing the songs Somewhere Over the Rainbow and We'll Meet Again, we can say that the setting has a big focus on 1939, as both of those songs were first released in that same year. Although, if you ask me, that only tells us the earliest year this could be set in. The whole post-apocalyptic nature of the world, I believe that's literally what the world is like, rather than the idea of it all being how Mr. Fingers views the world. There are definitely some moments that more so appear to be happening in his head, but most of what we see is reality, potentially implying that the start of World War II got nuclear and ended much earlier as a result. After all, references don't go past 1939, almost as if time or the world as we knew it stopped. For all we know, this could be what the world looks like shortly after a fallout in 1939 or many years after said fallout. But while I could talk about the shortage of civilization and nature and the presence of mutated humans, that's not really enough to prove this can't all be in Mr. Fingers' head. That's why I point to one of the most important episodes for the lore of the setting. Episode 5, Picnic. This episode sees Mr. Fingers set up a picnic where he's accompanied by a girl who stumbles upon his setup. It seems like typical Salad Fingers shenanigans until one big moment. Throughout the series, Mr. Fingers is constantly giving voice to others both externally and mentally. This time, however, after already giving the girl the name Nabel and narrating for her, she speaks on her own and sends Mr. Fingers into shock.
What's wrong?
Mr. Fingers was caught off guard and reacted by fleeing his picnic, locking himself in his house, and cowering in a corner. Everything he does in this series seems like he's narrating or directing a story, so this was something that threw him off script. He's fully experiencing something foreign to the world he's recalling and breaks down as a result. And another way to definitively prove this is happening in reality rather than Mr. Fingers' head is the lack of subtitles for her dialogue. Again, all other dialogue came from Mr. Fingers himself or his imagination for what others were saying, and those were always accompanied by those hand-drawn subtitles. This was the only exception. Well, that and the tree thing from Mr. Fingers' dream in episode 9, but yeah, that was clearly just a dream. This was real, and it demonstrated just how fractured Mr. Fingers' psyche is. And now, it's time to look into what this series presents to us. As previously mentioned, each episode sees Mr. Fingers going about each day like he's living in and telling a story. He has a vivid imagination to do this, as he ignores the fact that he lives in a wasteland and projects people onto random creatures and objects. Additionally, we can tell that he himself swaps between personalities or other characters frequently. It explains his mood swings and behavioral shifts. He's switching between roles in his reenactments. He's been timid characters, aggressive characters, and even feminine characters. But who are all of these characters he plays and projects? Furthermore, what is the significance of these stories? The most likely answer is that these are all roles of people who played major parts in Mr. Fingers' life, with Mr. Fingers' personal life and family history being the topic of his reenactments. And that brings up a depressing idea that, with the idea of the world truly being a post-apocalyptic one, Mr. Fingers became delusional and spends his days reliving and recreating his past and history because of that being all he knows. The only story he knows comes from the scars left from his own life. He doesn't do what other people you'd see in post-apocalyptic stories would, like adapt to change or try and rebuild. Mr. Fingers lost everything and can only think to relive his life before the fallout on Rewind. A life full of judgment, self-doubt, and abandonment. To start, I'm going to be bringing up a theory I first heard in MatPat's Salad Fingers content. So again, check out his Salad Fingers theories if you haven't already. The theory I'm referring to covers Mr. Fingers' identity. There's one recurring character in Mr. Fingers' tales that has a lot of evidence pointing towards them specifically being a stand-in for Mr. Fingers himself. That character being the finger puppet from episode 2, Hubert Cumberdale. Hubert is the most recurring finger puppet, always close to Mr. Fingers literally and metaphorically. He's an extra special puppet to Mr. Fingers, seeing as how he's basically like Mr. Fingers' sidekick, and Mr. Fingers gives him supernatural abilities. Mr. Fingers viewed Hubert Cumberdale with the abilities to transform, freely move, and act like a sentient being once made into a flesh boy. But more telling are the various times Hubert mirrors the appearance of Mr. Fingers. Hubert's wearing a top hat for his birthday. Next, Mr. Fingers says it's his birthday and gets a top hat of his own. Mr. Fingers puts on a toupee, then Hubert's seen with a matching toupee. But biggest of all, when Mr. Fingers put a mirror up to Hubert, it was Mr. Fingers' face in the reflection. So Mr. Fingers' tales are the stories of Hubert, his true identity. But what is his story, and how did it shape him? Episode 10, Birthday, is a good place to start and fill in the gaps. After all, this episode was about Hubert's birthday, or 2 of his birthdays to be exact. This episode shows Mr. Fingers reenacting the birthday he got his friend hat and the day of his actual birth. The day Hubert was born, he had to be surgically removed from his mother's womb. A detail we can piece together from Mr. Fingers going into the personality of a female undergoing a medical examination before imagining the hand puppet doctor digging into the side of a horse. In this moment, Mr. Fingers had a sudden shift, becoming a supportive figure as if the examination and medical procedure was for the horse all along. Then, from episode 9, Letter, we can add that Hubert's mother didn't live long after birthing Hubert. This episode has Mr. Fingers, like the mutant he is, release this black, gooey object from his body as if he gave birth. Mr. Fingers tried to take care of it like it was a newborn child, but he couldn't because the act of releasing it from inside of him put him in a state near death. In the end, he went on to give the baby thing, whatever, to Auntie Bainbridge. And while he didn't fully commit to that in the episode, it can be implied that this represents Hubert's mother leaving her newborn son to her family before she passed away. Plus, the parent personality of Hubert went away after going to deliver the baby to Auntie Bainbridge, possibly representing how this was probably one of the last acts of Hubert's mother before her passing. So we already have a sad start to Hubert's life with his mother dead sometime soon after his birth. But what about his father? For that, we'll have to retrace our steps back to the personality Mr. Fingers used to portray his mother. When in this personality, he acts quite young and flirtatious, especially towards men in the military fighting in the Great War. Episode 6, Present, reveals Jeremy Fisher was also fighting in the war, but came back to give Mr. Fingers a mini horse just like the one seen in episode 10. And considering this horse was used to represent Hubert's mother's surgical procedure to birth Hubert, it points to this event being connected to Jeremy's present. Later in the episode, Mr. Fingers swaps to a personality to respond to his own reflection in a fearful, defensive manner, followed by Mr. Fingers in a new personality throwing accusations at Jeremy Fisher. When you piece these two moments together, you can see that this was Mr. Fingers recreating a conversation between Jeremy Fisher and what seems to be the father of the girl Jeremy gave the gift to. The father confidently accuses Jeremy of wanting to deflower his daughter's rose, if you know what I mean, which seems to seal the idea of the horse symbolizing the woman becoming pregnant with Hubert thanks to Jeremy Fisher. Unfortunately for Jeremy, he got involved with the wrong girl, as he's seemingly killed by the overprotective father, represented by Mr. Fingers eating Jeremy twice, or eating another zombie the second time. Point is, Hubert had to grow up with both his mother and his father dead. But where did that leave Hubert? Sure, he was left to be raised and cared for by the rest of his mother's family, but it's not like they did a good job at that. Growing up, it's obvious that his family never treated him well, considering they never wanted him in the first place. He was mocked for his appearance, judged for making similar choices and mistakes as his father, told he was unclean because of the race of his father, and some family members even chose to flat out abandon him. The best example to show abandonment came from episode 4, Cage. This episode has Mr. Fingers play the part of a character who wants to flee to France, but gets stopped in his tracks and then trapped by this fetus creature. Even though the fetus harmed Mr. Fingers, caged him, and seemed aggressive at first, it's revealed that it all along wanted to love and be loved by Mr. Fingers, represented by it proposing to the caged Mr. Fingers. Eventually, though, Mr. Fingers managed to slip away, leaving the fetus alone and devastated. To Mr. Fingers, he was playing the part of one or maybe even multiple family members while projecting his younger self onto the fetus, showing how he was left and never loved by the only family he had left. All he had was a family that treated him like a stranger, just like that group of zombies at the dinner table at the end of episode 10. And all that did was break his psyche even more. Every negative thing done to or directed towards Hubert stuck with him, back then and now. Hubert grew to have a negative self-image where he believed he was just as worthless as everyone around him told him he was. We saw this in episode 11, Glass Brother, with the reflection of Mr. Fingers, or Glass Brother if you will, representing Mr. Fingers' self-image. Glass Mother was made to represent what shaped that self-image, all of the negative interactions with family and loved ones, as well as how he saw his family. And that would always stick with him, no matter how hard he'd try to rid himself of that mentality. Pieces would remain, scars would be left. All he could do was try to lessen those thoughts and combat them by building confidence. That confidence being represented by transforming the Hubert finger puppet into a flesh boy that brought Mr. Fingers great joy. It was Hubert finding something that made him feel like a real boy, like someone who belongs. Along with that, Hubert would even make a new friend, the person who tried to be sent away by Hubert's family, who would end up giving Hubert that friendship hat on his birthday. But where does that leave Mr. Fingers now? The fallout resulted in an absence of life, potentially meaning everyone who was left in his life didn't survive the catastrophe. Friends, family, anyone else who had any involvement in Mr. Fingers' life are all long gone. He's all alone. He's a survivor, yes, but he has nothing left. Nothing but his broken mind. With a life full of trauma he was never fully able to move on from, he feels incomplete. All he can do is recreate the only life he had, even if it was the one that left him permanently damaged. Nevertheless, David Firth did an outstanding job at conveying all of this. The art style, the sound design, Mr. Fingers' mannerisms, they all make it so Mr. Fingers would at first appear to be creepy and threatening. But the longer you stick around, the more you begin to see the true person Mr. Fingers is and sympathize with him. As an experience given to the audience, the character of Mr. Fingers has a beautiful element of don't judge a book by its cover. Those who are too scared or disturbed to watch past episode 1 or 2 may never realize the truth. But those brave enough to continue learn just how wrong they were to judge Mr. Fingers in the first place. As always, thank you for watching. Don't forget to do the typical YouTube stuff if you enjoyed this video. Like the video, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, and if you want to support the channel and get some neat perks, consider clicking the join button and seeing how you can become a channel member today.